What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing. The Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series will continue its conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. Now, moving forward, what I will be doing is changing up a little bit. I'm going to be getting into more detail about the fighter in question and his opponent. I think it's better that you have a much broader understanding on the significance of the fight in question by the opponent in which the fighter in question is facing. What took place during that time? Remember, we are changing of the guard from era to era, champion by champion, moving up to different decades. So it's better that we have an understanding on the importance of this particular fight in question through the opponent's resume, who he fought coming into that fight. Did they fight the same arenas? Did they fight in the same time? Was one fighter in a generation that was earlier than the fighter he's facing? Is he leaving his career? So on and so forth. So we'll have a better idea of the significance of the fight by the referees, by the promoters, the arenas, the laws that were changed, who benefited from that time of the changing of that guard. So I'll speak a little bit more detailed about the fight that I'm talking about, if you understand where I'm coming from. So moving forward, I'll break down the fight, the opponents, and give you a little bit more background for the fight in question, so you have a better idea moving forward in the lightweights going up to the heavyweights. So when those new fighters come in, we'll see how the fighters were challenged and what was on the line during the course of that fight. You'll understand as I move on. So on Thursday night, November 30th, 1911, 25-year-old lightweight Freddie Welch defeats 20-year-old Willie Ritchie. He fought him in 20 rounds. Now, the contest took place in Vernon Arena. Now, who was Freddie Welch? His name was Frederick Hall Thomas. He was known as the Welch Wizard. He was born March 5th, 1886 in Pontypridd, Wales, United Kingdom. He stood 5'7". He was a lightweight and had a 68.5-inch reach, and died July 29th, 1927. He was 41 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He had a total bout career of 87 fights, 74 wins, 5 losses, 34 knockouts, and he was stopped one time in his career. Now, he defeated Cardiff, Wales, EBBU lightweight champion Jim Driscoll, December 20th, 1910. Jim Driscoll lost the title on the foul because he was encouraging headbutts in that fight. He defeated Melbourne's Australia's lightweight Hughie Melgon, December 16th, 1912. It was for the Commonwealth British Empire title. Now, the British version of the World Lightweight Championship title was what was at stake. He defeated world lightweight champion Willie Ritchie at the Olympia. The referee was Eugene Corey, and he recognized Freddie Welch as the world lightweight champion on Tuesday, July 7th, 1914. Now, Freddie Welch would lose and regain his world lightweight championship title before finally losing the crown on May 28th, 1917. It was at the New York's Madison Casino. Now, Freddie Welch went down a total of 3 times in that fight with the fighter that we're going to be talking about. He was 21-year-old from the Lower East Side, Jewish ghetto wizard, Benny Leonard. The referee was Billy Kid McCarthy, and he counts to 10 as a 31-year-old Freddie Welch is the new former lightweight champion, and Benny Leonard is the brand new lightweight champion at the age of 21. When you look at it from that perspective, Freddie Welch was 31 years old. Now, we talked about him in many fights before leading up to this contest. Now, that happened in 1917. We're in 1912 right now. Or 1911, at the end of 1911. But when he fought Benny Leonard, it was in 1917. Freddie Welch had a lot of miles in him by the time he faced Benny Leonard. However, Benny Leonard, that was the changing of the guard in the lightweight division, because Benny Leonard brought in a new style of fighting. Now, Daniel Mendoza, as I spoke to you before, was the first Jewish champion. He was in the heavyweight division, although he was really a middleweight. And he was the first one that came up with the bouncing around, holding your hands up, stinging out the jab and moving around from side to side. Well, Benny Leonard took it to another level with foot movement. He began feinting with his feet, feinting with his shoulders, moving his head from side to side, poking out the jab, not all the way but halfway to get you to react. Benny Leonard was changing how the boxing style was accustomed. Now we look at Joe Gans. Joe Gans invented the jab and the 1-2 combination punch. But with Joe Gans learned how to jab through basically setting up his opponent. And he learned that by hanging a piece of meat in the back porch, waiting for the flies to come, and making sure that the flies were not reacting before him. So he knew he had to throw short punches, but from the shoulder. He wasn't swinging wildly. So his punches were straighter and they were faster. He changed the guard when he came in to the game of boxing. But when Benny Leonard came in, he used more foot movement, more feints. He moved from side to side. And that was the changing of the guard in 1917. So I want to keep us focused on the changing of the guard, the changing of the era, the styles as they began to adjust. So that happened in 1917. Right now we're towards the end of 1911. So Tuesday, December 26, 1911, the Australian heavyweight champion, Oxnard Cyclone Sam McVeigh, becomes the newly crowned colored world heavyweight champion, as the referee Snowy Baker awards McVeigh the new world colored heavyweight championship title when he defeats Sam Langford in 20 rounds. Now, once again, with Sam Langford, he began boxing in 1902, but most of his career was in 1903. 02, he had just a few fights. 1903, he would face fighters such as Joe Gans. He was in the ring with fighters such as Jack Blackburn. These men knew the scientific parts of boxing. So Sam Langford, although he was good enough leaving the Lenox Athletic Club in Boston, but he learned a lot from Joe Gans. He learned a lot from Jack Blackburn. He was in the ring with Jack Blackburn 6 times. So at this point of Sam Langford's career, he would run into the Oxnard Cyclone Sam McVeigh. He would start facing the Joe Jeannettes, and he would face eventually Harry Wills. They all had different styles. So when you watch the eras as they change, you begin to see the difficulties some men would have or the changing, the adjustments that men would have. And that's how you can judge fighters. And that's why I say Sam Langford, since we're talking about him, is the greatest fighter of all times, because the adjustments that he was able to make from 1902 to 1926, he would start losing his eyesight and he would retire. Benny Leonard, as he made those adjustments with his feet, with the head movement, take you back for one moment before I move forward. The other Jewish heavyweight was Joe Chowensky. He would take Jack Johnson into prison, and he would show him some things that he saw weakness in Jack Johnson. Most of the Jewish fighters were that way. They had the ability to shift their body around from side to side. Like I said, the first Jewish fighter who would become champion, he was one of the most wittiest fighters. And when you look at Daniel Mendoza, because that's what I'm talking about, he began to move his arms up straighter. They wasn't down to his waistline. They were up towards his shoulders. His hands were facing his shoulders. And his hands were faster, they were straighter, and he was able to move around with his feet much easier. So most Jewish fighters fought like that, but Benny Leonard took it to a different level. And we'll learn more about that when Benny Leonard becomes champion in 1917 with Freddie Welch. So I just wanted to stay on topic of the changing of the era. The men who were leaving a decade and going into a new decade, either they had problems with the new fighters coming up or they made the adjustments. And that's how you can tell the greatness of a fighter, if he can make the adjustment, if he can adapt to new eras. So in 1912, the Anti-Prize Ring fight film, U.S. Federal Law Act, 1912-1940. So we've got to pay attention to that because the fight films, that law had changed. January 1st, 1912, 19-year-old featherweight, Mexican Joe Rivers, KO's former lightweight champion, 21-year-old Frankie Coley, 11 rounds in Vernon, California. Now, the referee was Charles Eiton. Now, Charles Eiton was in a lot of fights, and we went over a lot of the fights that Charles Eiton had referees. Before him, it was Charlie White. And you can see even with the referees how things begin to change. So we'll learn more about that as we move forward. February 3rd, 1912, Toronto, Canada, bantamweight Johnny Colin, better known as the cherry picker of Logan Square. He defeats and remains champion when he would take on Frankie Colin in 20 rounds in Vernon, California. Now, Frankie Colin's name consistently comes up. He was a mob-driven fighter. That's why he got so many fights. He was a very good fighter, but he was selected. He was placed in certain fights. And I know that because I read that personally. And I was told that by some of the older fellas when I was in my teens, many years ago. Now, Mexican Joe Rivers was born March 19, 1892, Los Angeles, California. His name was Andrew Wabera. He died June 26, 1957. He fought from 1910 to 1923. And we'll learn more about Mexican Joe Rivers as his career continues. He ended his career in 1923. He was a very good fighter, but he was born in California, Los Angeles. Wasn't born in Mexico. He was born in California. He saw a lot more than some of the Mexican fighters. The first Mexican fighter was Solly Seaman. But we'll learn more about the Mexican fighters coming up. But Mexican Joe Rivers was a very, very good calculating fighter. And he's famous for the famous double knockdown with Ad Wargas. And the referee in that fight was Jack Welch. But we'll go through that as that time arrives. Now, February 22nd, 1912, Cleveland, Ohio's featherweight, 22-year-old John Patrick Kilbane. You know him as Johnny Kilbane. He defeats the world featherweight champion, Little Hebrew, 29-year-old Abe Patel in 20 rounds. It was at the Vernon, California. He would become the world featherweight champion, weighing 122 pounds. The referee was Charles Eiton. He awarded Kilbane the decision, the featherweight championship title. Now, Johnny Kilbane was born April 18, 1889 in Cleveland, Ohio. He would die May 31st, 1957 in Cleveland, Ohio. He stood 5'5". He had a 68-inch reach. He fought from 1907 to 1923. He had a total bout career of 63 bouts, 49 wins, 6 losses, 24 knockouts. He was stopped 3 times and had 7 draws. He defeated the likes of Mexican Joe Rivers, Chicago's Charlie White, who was a beautiful fighter, by the way, Charlie White, Frankie Conley, Abe Patel, Tommy Dixon. He went by the name Memphis Tommy Dixon. Orange, New Jersey's Johnny Dundee. He was known as the Scotch Wop. Philadelphia's Eddie O'Keefe. He was another good fighter. He was fighting at that time when you had the 2-ounce, somewhat bicycle leather gloves. Buffalo, New York's future lightweight champion, Rocky Kansas. Denmark's future bantamweight champion, Kid Williams. Brooklyn, New York's Eddie Wallace, who was another outstanding fighter, was Eddie Wallace. New York's future world lightweight champion, Ghetto Wizard, Benny Leonard. These were some of the opponents that Mexican Joe Rivers would face. Now, Thursday, February 22nd, 1912, middleweight Frank Mantell. He was out of Brandenburg, Germany. And he would defeat former middleweight champion out of Illinois, Billy Papke. Now, we talked about him many times. He was known as the Illinois Thunderbolt. And he would face him 20 rounds in Sacramento, California. He would defeat him. Now, Frank Mantel would claim the middleweight championship title, but only be recognized in the state of California. Frank Mantel, his name was Frank Otto Mantel. He was born June 25th, 1886, in Brandenburg, Germany. He would die October 9th, 1951, in Rhode Island, New York. He stood 5'9.5" as middleweight. Thursday, February 29th, 1912, future world light heavyweight champion, Orchard Man of France. His name was Georges Compartier. He knocks out Jim Sullivan. Bermondsey, London, United Kingdom. They fought for the EBU middleweight championship title in Monte Carlo. Referee was Fernand Crony. He awarded Compartier the title. Georges Compartier, the Orchard Man. He was born January 12, 1894 in France. He would die October 28, 1975 in France as well. He was 81 years of age at the time of his death, and he stood 5'11", and he went up to light heavyweight. He fought from 1908 to 1926. Now, Georges Compartier was one of the few fighters who would fight from, he basically fought in every weight division that you had. At the age of 16, he was a referee for the Frank Moran and Jack Johnson bout. Georges Compartier, the Orchid Man, was a very impressive fighter to me. It was more to him than just boxing. He was boxing his entire life, but he was a student of the game. And he would lose his title in 1922. To me, 1922 was one of the most upsetting years besides 1951 in all of boxing, because you had so many champions who would lose their titles that year, as 1951 as well. And we'll go through that when that time comes. But 1922, Georges Compartier would lose his title to the first black light heavyweight champion, and his name was Balansiki. And that was a controversial fight, but we'll go through that when that time arrives. That was 1922. Georges Compartier, the Orchid Man, outstanding fighter. He was in there with Jack Dempsey's and Gene Tunney's, on and on. But we'll talk more about him when the time comes. In fact, let's get into Georges Compartier for a second. He'd be in the ring with Jack Dempsey, July 12, 1921. Gene Tunney, July 24, 1924. Frank Klaus, who was a middleweight champion of the world, June 24, 1912. Billy Papke, October 23, 1912. Willie Lewis, May 22, 1912. Baling Levinsky, October 12, 1920. Teddy Kid Lewis, May 11, 1922. Balansiki, September 24th, 1922. That's when he would lose his light heavyweight championship title. He would win when he took on Baling Levinsky. Tommy Laughlin, who was the Philly Phantom, June 17th, 1926. Tommy Gibbons. Now, Tommy Gibbons had a brother, an older brother, Mike Gibbons. He was the St. Paul Phantom. All of these men during that time were courageous and outstanding fighters. Tommy Gibbons only lost 4 fights or 5 fights, but he was an outstanding fighter himself. Now, he would also take on Jeff Smith, as well as Joe Beckett. Now, Jeff Smith, the Bayonne Globetrotter, has to be, well, he is in the top 10 greatest middleweight category, in my opinion. But Jeff Smith could beat any middleweight in the world in boxing, in my opinion, in history. Because as you change eras, you adapt to your change. And Jeff Smith, Mike Gibbons, Billy Papke, all of these fighters. Now, Jeff Smith, he lived in Harlem. He was living in Queens, then he moved to Harlem. Then he moved to, when he was in Harlem, he would spar a lot with Johnny Wilson. Johnny Wilson was a southpaw who would eventually lose his title 1923 to Harry Greb. But Johnny Wilson would take the title away from a fighter out of St. Paul. And that fighter was a very good fighter as well. Wanted to give you some more light. So the fighter's name was Mike O'Dowd. Now, Mike O'Dowd was out of St. Paul. He would take his title from Al McCoy. But Mike O'Dowd would fight some really good fighters. I remember he fought Billy Perkins, Billy Misk, all those fighters were very good fighters during their day. He was in the ring with Jack Britton. I believe it was 1916. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was. And he fought him in 1917. Mike O'Dowd is underrated for people who don't study the game. They don't really know who he is. He was an outstanding fighter as well. So I just wanted to give you a better perspective on the opponents and who we're talking about, the significance of the fighters and the significance of the fights. So George Compartier was an outstanding fighter. June 23rd, Digger Stanley would lose to Charles LeDux in a rematch. Now, Digger Stanley had faced Charles LeDux April 22nd, 1912. He was better known as Digger Stanley, but they called him George Stanley. And he was at Norfolk, United Kingdom. He defeated Charles LeDux in 20 rounds, and he would retain his British Bantamweight Championship title. But on June 23rd, Digger Stanley would lose to Charles LeDux in a rematch. So Charles LeDux would now become the new Bantamweight champion when he would defeat Digger Stanley. May 3rd, 1912, heavyweight Luther McCarthy KOs Carl Morris in the 6th round. It was in Springfield, Missouri. And it was for the White Hope Heavyweight Championship title that was created when Jack Johnson became the World Heavyweight Champion in 1908. So they created it between 1911 and 1915. May 13th, Boston Bone Crusher Sam Langford would defeat Jim Barry. And it was a vicious left hook to the head that got him out of there in 11 rounds. And it caused Jack Mitchell, who was the referee, to count out Barry, who was stretched out flat like a pancake. Sam Langford was gaining momentum, if you will. He was adjusting to the new styles. He was adjusting to the fighters. None of these fighters in that era could defeat Sam Langford. If you defeated him, it was for whatever reason. But from hand-to-hand contact, they couldn't defeat Sam Langford. Sam Langford was the perfect height. He was the perfect size to deal with the contrast of styles. He was a devastating puncher. He would walk right to you, move his head from side to side. He knew how to jab. He knew how to throw his right-hand lead. But he would walk right in front of you, walk you down all over that ring. Sam Langford was phenomenal. He was actually an unbelievable fighter. I have him ranked number 1 as the greatest fighter of all times. Now, Sam Langford would face Jim Barry in Melbourne, Australia. They would fight 12 times. Sam Langford would defeat him. Well, it was 6 no decision round bouts, 5 knockouts, 1 draw. 2 fights were stopped by a referee. Now, Jim Barry, who was he? His name was James J. Barry. He was born August 12, 1886 in Cumberston, Montana. He would die March 12, 1917. He was 31 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in California. He stood 5 foot 10 and a half inches as heavyweight, fought from 1906 to 1917. Now, once again, keep in mind, this is all at the top of my head. I'm not reading or looking at anything. I'm just remembering what I have studied, and I'm trying not to stumble or trying not to get a date wrong, but this is what I'm doing. I'm just having a conversation, laying on my couch talking to you. So May 21st, Johnny Kilbane defends his World Featherweight Championship title over Jimmy Welsh. Now, Jimmy Welsh, I talked about him in the last video, and I told you how how good of a fighter he was. In fact, let me show you Jimmy Welch for 1 second. Now, I just wanted to show you a profile of Jimmy Welch. Jimmy Welch, it really took Sam Langford by the hand and showed him a lot. Really helped guide him to an extent back when they were in Massachusetts. But he was a phenomenal fighter. He was a bantamweight, and he was very strong. Very strong fighter was Jimmy Walsh, and I just wanted to show you Jimmy Walsh for a moment. He was significant. Now, Jimmy Walsh, well, we're talking about him. He was 28 years old. He weighed 119 pounds. He had a record of 50 wins, 16 losses, and 20 draws. He was born July 18th, 1883 in Newton, Massachusetts. He died November 23rd, 1964. He was 81 years of age at the time of his death. And the thing with him, he only stood 5'2". He was a bantamweight, fought from 1902 to 1914. He carried a record of 64 total bouts, 33 wins, 10 losses, 14 knockouts, and he was stopped 1 time. He had 20 draws. He was KO'd by Kid Williams in his 2nd round, February 6, 1904. He fought under the name Kid Lewis at that time for that bout. Kid Williams. He fought under Kid Lewis. Now, what was interesting about Welch is, like I told you, he was stopped just 1 time, but he was a very witty fighter. Very, very witty fighter. So I just wanted to give you a perspective on Jimmy Welch. Very good fighter he was. Now I'm going to end this video. I just wanted to show you a few fighters that we talked about. Owen Moran. Owen Moran was from London. Very good fighter he was. He's not talked about as often as he should be, but he was a very, very good fighter, was Owen Moran. We talked about Mexican Joe Rivers out of Los Angeles, California. Another good fighter was Mexican Joe Rivers. He was 19 years old when he basically got started as a pro, and he was very good with his hands. He just came around at a time when you had guys like Ad Wargas, who had Jack Welch in his pocket, and he was railroaded. But Joe Rivers was a very good fighter. I mentioned to you Harlem Tommy Murphy. He was out of New York, out of Harlem. And he was another fighter. Very, very good. Basic fighter. Had strong fundamentals. He would become a champion. But he was a good fighter, was Harlem Tommy Murphy. A very good fighter. It's an understatement. Now here you have Johnny Coolin. He was a bantamweight. He was out of Ontario, Canada, but he would reside in Chicago, Illinois. Another good fighter. A very good fighter. Like I told you, I had a friend, and he studied boxing. That's all he did when he was a kid, studied boxing. He lived to be in his 80s. When I met Teddy, Teddy was in his 70s at that time. So I spent about 10 years learning boxing with and through him. But when he was a little kid, that's all he did was boxing. He knew all these guys personally. He took boxing very seriously as far as studying it, going to the fights, and so on and so forth. He knew Johnny Coolin. And he told me a lot of stories about him. The best story that Teddy told me, in fact, I got to meet him because he was at Teddy's house, was Ruby Goldstein. Ruby Goldstein lived on Cherry Street. He moved in the 1970s out of New York. I don't remember what state he moved to, but he used to live in New York on the Lower East Side on Cherry Street, and the next complex from where Teddy lived. And one day I went to go see Teddy, and Ruby Goldstein was sitting on the couch. Now, I didn't recognize Goldstein because obviously I knew Goldstein watching him in films and on, magazines when he was a young man. Well, younger than he was when I saw him. So I didn't quite make him out. So Teddy said to me, "Do you know who this man is?" And I couldn't make him out, but I could see the features. He said, "Take a good look at him." And yes, Ray Robinson, I can't quite. Yeah, I know Ray Robinson. Benny Kipperett. It started coming together. And I realized that was Ruby Goldstein. It chokes you up. And he told me about the Benny Kipperett, and he talked about the fights with Joe Louis and Walcott. We talked about Robinson and Randy Turpin. Well, I'm choking up here. I'm gonna end this video. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Thanks for listening. We will continue with the complete history of boxing. Be well. Thanks for listening. Peace.